have you ever walked into a room and instantly known something important just happened in this room? Like no one's there, no one has to tell you that something important happened, because maybe it's like you walk in and you smell freshly baked cookies. Something important happened in that room, right? You see flour on the table or something. There's evidence there that shows you something happened here. Maybe it was a trail of muddy footprints. If you're a parent and you've seen muddy footprints through something, no one else is in the room, but you know someone was here. I see the muddy footprints all throughout the room. You didn't see the person, but you didn't have to, because the evidence of some kind was in the room with you. Or think about a mystery movie or a TV show, something like that. You know, there's Sherlock Holmes stories, the books, and even many renditions of them have been made into TV shows and movies now, or other murder mystery type thing, Agatha Christie type novels and movies where the detective walks in and gets to the scene and just like starts pointing out all of the things that everyone missed, right? Like a broken, like there's a crack in a vase, or there's a phone still recording, or something random in the room that they just noticed that no one else noticed. And suddenly what seemed hidden in the mystery, it suddenly becomes clear in that moment, and the truth, because the truth leaves a trail. But what we've been seeing through our study in the book of Esther, we've titled it Evidence. We have seen that even though we don't see God's name mentioned even once in the whole book, you can't miss his fingerprints all over the story. We've been learning that what it looks like to see God even when we don't see God. But here's the question that we're asking today. In your life, in the everyday moments where it's hard to see God's hand, what evidence do you have that he's at work? Because it's in the moments often that we go, I can't see his hand at work. So where do we find the evidence in the moment to know that God's hand is at work? Well, I'd suggest to you this morning, you are the evidence. And I hope that we'll see that as we go through, you remembering his faithfulness, you passing it on, you living it out. Your life is the trail that reminds you and tells others that God was here at work. God is still at work, and he will always be at work accomplishing his good purposes. So let's pick up where we left off last week and see the amazing conclusion of this story and what the Jews did to remember what God had done here. Let's read verses 1 through 19 to see really what just takes place. We kind of left it on a cliffhanger. The law of the Medes and Persians is still in place of the Jews being able to be annihilated or attacked on this specific day. But we also saw last week that a new law of the Medes and Persians has also been put into place, that if any of them attack the Jews on this day, that the Jews can defend themselves and kill those who would attack them. So what happens then? That was about 9 months ago in the story. What happens then when the day comes that all of that is allowed? That's where we pick it up in chapter 9 and verse 1. It says, now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped, I love how it words that, had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, I'm not going to even try to say those 10 names, okay? You can do that on your own time. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a great day, a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. So the day comes where the law of the Medes and Persians allows anyone who hates the Jews or who would want to get more wealth and possessions by taking them out can legally come after them, annihilate all of them and plunder their possessions. But the law of the Medes and Persians also stated that if any Jew was attacked, they were allowed to defend themselves by killing their attackers, and they were allowed to plunder any of their possessions. So there's like two things at play. You can annihilate all of the Jews and take all of their stuff, but just know if you try to do so, the Jews are allowed to kill you and take all of your stuff instead. So what's going to happen? Well, they did so. The people that on that one day, many actually took arms and attacked the Jews. Even after the law was put in place that said they are allowed to defend themselves and take all of your stuff, there were still thousands. It tells us 75,000 of them were killed. Like 75,810, if you want to get the exact number, 75,810 of them came after the Jews on that day. And they hoped to take them over. The Jews, though, it says, defeated all of those attackers. 500 in the city of Shushan alone on the first day, and 75,000 total among all the other provinces, which averages out to about 600 per province. If you remember, there's 127 provinces in this place, plus the 10 sons of Haman, it tells us. And then I love it because it tells us the bodies of the 10 sons of Haman are hanged on Haman's gallows as a warning to the enemy. An interesting note is in many of the Hebrew scriptures, if they're looking at the book of Esther, those 10 names that I didn't even try to pronounce, those 10 names in their Hebrew scriptures are shaped as a gallows. Like, I just think that's cool that they shape them as a gallows in their actual Hebrew scriptures. But the king says to Esther, after all this has taken place, he goes, okay, you all have killed 500 in Shushan, the palace city. What would you like to be done now? And what has taken place in all the other provinces? Do you have any further requests? Whatever you say, let's do it. We're going to do it. And what it tells us is that Esther requests that it be allowed for the Jews to defend themselves one extra day in the palace city of Shushan. Now, we don't know all of the details. Most likely, what took place was she realized Shushan is the place where Haman had the most prominence. Haman had the most influence in people's life. He had been giving a lot of people favors and paying them off in the city. Many in the city bowed before him every single day. So he would have had a large following, and some of them may have decided, well, we'll just go the next day because the law doesn't say that they can defend themselves tomorrow. We'll just go tomorrow. And maybe she even got some intelligence from other people that said, hey, they're planning on attacking tomorrow too. Whatever the case was, she went to the king and said, let us defend ourselves one more day, which ended up being a wise request because the next day, 300 more tried to attack the Jews in Shushan, the palace city, and all of them, again, overtaken and killed by the Jews. Now, here's something that's interesting to me as you read all of that takes place. I don't know if you noticed, it mentioned like 3, maybe 4 times, but they did not take the plunder. It said that. They did not take the plunder. They have now taken out the sons of the Amalekites, but they did not take their plunder. If you remember, just to recall to our memory, something we said at the beginning of the story of Esther as we were studying, is that this is actually a story that really fulfills the command that God had given so long ago to King Saul. Do you remember the story? We talked a little bit about it, that King Saul had been told, go and wipe out every single one of the Amalekites, leave 0 of them alive, and take none of the plunder. That was the command, okay? Go, take out every single one of them, and leave all the possessions. Don't take any of it. Now, what did King Saul do? He killed every single one of them, except for King Agag. He brought him back. What's that called? Disobedience, right? Wiped them all out, but he left one alive. Then I love that exchange. If you go read it, I think it's like chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, where it might be 2 Samuel. It's somewhere there in the middle. And as you go and you read this story, it tells us that not only did he leave the king alive, Agag, who we find out in the book of Esther, is the reason that Haman is even a person in the story of Esther, because he's Haman the Agagite. He was a descendant of the Amalekites. But not only did he leave Agag alive, but he comes in and Samuel goes, hey, what? I thought we were pretty clear. I thought God was like really clear on what you're supposed to do. Kill everyone and don't take anything. And he said, oh, well, we didn't take anything. And then in the background, there's like, right? Do you remember the story? Because Samuel goes, then why do I hear the bleating of these sheep? And Saul's all of a sudden like, oh yeah, those possessions, like that plunder. I was going to sacrifice those to the Lord. That's what I was going to do. And Samuel, that's where we get that phrase where Samuel goes and looks him in the face and he says this, to obey is better than sacrifice. That's where that phrase comes from, is that story. So remember everything Saul didn't do. Now in this story, we see the people fulfilling really the command that was given to King Saul so long ago, to wipe out all of the sons of the Amalekites. All of these Haman's sons are gone now. And then on top of that, they were allowed to take the plunder, but they didn't. So there's parallelism here that we see in the scriptures where they were fulfilling what was told from their descendant, or what was commanded of their descendant all those years ago. They would not commit the same folly as King Saul. They were going to take them out, and they were not going to take the plunder. Now, we've studied this story, and we've seen God's hand at work through it all. Right there, like that, the fact that even took place is very obviously God's hand at work, because there were not like a ridiculous amount of Jews in the Persian Empire at this time. A lot of them had already started heading back to the promised land, to their land where they could live. God had already allowed that, and many of them had gone back. So they got help from even some of the enemies to take out these people who would attack them. It was God at work. And we've seen that all throughout this story. But as I said just a moment ago, often when we're living out the story, it's not as easy to see God's hand at work. We can't see how God's working often in the moment. How do we see God's working in our lives? Most of the time, it's when we get to the other side of the situation and we look back at it and we go, oh, right? How many of you can testify to that? In the moment, you're like, what are you doing, God? And then at the end, you're like, oh, now I see it. Yeah, I'm stupid. Yeah, you knew all the whole way, God, what you were doing. Yeah, that's often how it takes place, that we see his hand so evidently when we're on the other side of it looking back. But what do we do in those times when we're in the moment and can't see God's hand at work? What do we do in those times to help ourselves trust God's faithfulness the next time we can't see him at work? Well, here are 3 things I see in the conclusion of Esther that I believe narrate for us some practical ways to see God when we don't see God in the present. And it's by looking to the evidence of God's faithfulness in the past. Look at what they did in verse 20 through 22. It tells us that they set up a holiday. It tells us this: Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly. So we just read they celebrated that day. The people in all the other provinces on the 14th day of Adar celebrated what had just taken place the day before, and the people in Shushan, the citadel, celebrated on the 15th of Adar what had taken place the 13th and the 14th. But now it tells us that they've put in place, this is something that we should celebrate yearly, the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar. As the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot, which Haman had devised against the Jews, should not return on his own head. What's it doing? It's recounting the whole reason they're celebrating, okay? It's telling the whole story again in a little bitty place, and then it tells us this: they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them. So what it tells us is this: Mordecai sends a letter out to everyone and says, this is cause for celebration. We're going to set this up not as just a day where we feast, and right now we're going to do this every single year on the same 2 days, giving presents to one another, gifts to the poor, because of all of these things. And it recounts the whole story. Because of all these things, we will celebrate every single year. And I love how they go, what should we call this holiday? Well, Haman decided the day by just throwing dice. Pur, okay? Purim is what they named it, because they said, hey, that's how he determined the day, so we'll just name it the way that he determined the day, because he actually ended up determining his own demise and the saving of God's people. And so they name it Purim. So what do we see that we can do in these moments to remember in future days when we can't see God at work? What do we do in those moments that can help us to see the faithfulness of God? Well, we see the evidence by doing this. We show the evidence when we remember God's faithfulness. Or another word you could say is we celebrate God's faithfulness. We see the Israelites actually do this a lot in Scripture. Some of them were commanded by God. Some God said, you shall do this. You will celebrate these days because of Passover. You will celebrate these days because of the Day of Atonement. You will celebrate these days because of how I brought you out of the land of Egypt. You will do these things. But there are all throughout Scripture times where they saw God at work and they decided this is something that we need to remember for years to come. If you remember in one of our small groups, we studied the book of Joshua, and we saw that when they went to the Jordan River and they stepped out on it, and God caused the Jordan River to stop so that they could walk on dry ground, just as he had done for them at the Red Sea, and they get into the promised land. On the other side, they set up 12 stones. 12 stones as a memorial. And it tells us in that chapter of Joshua, chapter number 4, they say this: these stones shall be a memorial to the children of Israel forever. What were they doing? They were setting up a monument so that anytime anyone passed by that set of 12 stones, it probably had an inscription on it too, but there were 12 stones there. They would walk by and they go, God, what he did for us at the Jordan River, I remember it. I celebrate it in this moment because I see this memorial. We see even the Feast of Booths and tents and tabernacles that God had put in place for them to remember God's provision and presence during the wilderness journey. They would every year stay in tents as they came together for this feast. Even though they owned houses, they would bring tents and stay in tents. Why? To celebrate that God sustained them through the wilderness by living in tents. What a tradition, right? That they would just consistently set up tents to remember that God made the children of Israel dwell in tents. There's another one in 1 Samuel chapter number 7 where there's that Ebenezer stone that they set up. Often there's a song, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," that often we don't sing the second verse in churches anymore because people don't know what Ebenezer means. We sing, "Here I raise my Ebenezer," and people go, what's Scrooge got to do with this, right? Because they're thinking of the Christmas story. But that Ebenezer stone in that story was a time where God delivered the children of Israel from the hand of the Philistines. And so Samuel set up a stone and called it Ebenezer, which means this: we were helped by God. So every time someone looked at the Ebenezer stone, they would go, "Hey, God helped us." We celebrate it. We memorialize it. We remember it. The Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 31, he says this song will not be forgotten in their mouths. This is a song that we are setting up to consistently and keep on remembering the faithfulness of God. Here in Esther, they do it to remember God's deliverance through Esther and Mordecai from Haman's evil plot. They set up this holiday of Purim to celebrate God's faithfulness. You know, one of the ways that we can consistently remember in the moment, like this moment that I don't see God's hand at work, where's the evidence that God is working right now? I remember the way he worked back then. That's what the celebration or the remembering is. Some ways that we can constantly do this, just practical ways that people often do this in their lives. One is to journal. Over time, as they journal the blessings of God, they just say, "Hey, God did this in my life." They just write down on a piece of paper. That's all it is. It's not, when I say journal, I'm not saying like, oh, you have to write a 5-paragraph essay every single day in some kind of journal. Just sometimes you just look at the day and you go, "Hey, today, God had someone pay for my meal. Hey, today, God had this happen. This friend that I haven't talked to in forever texted me." Whatever it is, just writing down things that you see God doing at work. And then when those times where you can't see God at work, you open up that remembrance, that memorial, and you go, "He works. I remember it." And over time, this becomes a record of God's hand in your life. Your own, as in Malachi calls it, a book of remembrance. Rebecca's grandmother, I love how she actually did this. As Rebecca went to her grandmother's funeral last year, they were looking through some of her things, and they found just her prayer and gratitude journals all throughout. And I love, they took a couple of pictures and just like covered, right, with prayer requests and dates of when things were answered and dates of when these are down. I love this one right here, June 24th of that year. You know what happened that day? I'm pretty thankful for it. Rebecca Sue Boyer was born. That's what it says. She just wrote down a blessing of a grandchild. God worked today. I have a new grandchild. And every single day she wrote down these things, and it helped her to consistently be able to say, "God is working in my life. Even if I don't see it, I know he is." How do I know? Because he's been so doing all along. And one thing that this does as well, and I love this and we'll get to it in just a moment, is it actually now helps her future generations, like Rebecca, to go, "Man, I don't see God working in my life. But you know, he worked in my grandma's life." And over again, being reminded of the goodness of God. Some people, they create a physical reminder. They have some, like an actual Ebenezer stone of some kind. I actually have a couple of these that when I was in camp at teen camps and junior camps and things like that, where sometimes a preacher would preach on something and then hand us all something that had to do with that message. And it's like, if you made a decision, write that decision on this little blue ribbon. I have a little blue ribbon in my Bible of a day where I made a decision that I was going to be set apart for God, just like the blue ribbon set the priests apart for God. Like, I just remember that decision by having that little memorial. I have a stone that every time I see it, I go, that's when I surrendered to preach. That's what God did in my life. And I actually have some of these physical things. Sometimes people just like, they're on a hike, they see the goodness of the Lord and all of his creation, and they're like, "Man, this is so amazing. I need a rock from this." And they just pick up a rock and they use it as a physical reminder. I met with God that day. This is something that the Israelites consistently do. You could create a physical reminder. You could celebrate your spiritual anniversaries. If you remember the day you got saved, write it down, and every year, thank the Lord for it. Every year, remember, he saved me on this day so many years ago. The day you got baptized, the day that you made special decisions, write it down and celebrate those spiritual anniversaries. Another one is you can go to church. And how many times can we testify to the fact that you walk into the doors of the church on a bad week and all of a sudden your spirits are just lifted? What is that? That's God's faithfulness to work in your life, the way that he designed the church to work. You can take and save photos to remind you of God's faithfulness. And I'm sure we could come up with so many other ways if you really wanted to think and to remember and celebrate the faithfulness of God in your life. But why do we do this? Because in the here and now, I can't always see the evidence of God's working in my situation. And that can be disheartening. And Satan would love to use that to derail you and to cause you to doubt God's working and God's faithfulness. But you can look to those remembrances and those celebrations of God's past working, of God's past faithfulness. And it can help you in this moment to trust God really is at work. Remembering isn't just about sentiment. It's not just like oh, yeah, that was an amazing time that God did in my life. Remembering is about sustaining faith today. It's about helping us today to keep going. When you remember and celebrate God's faithfulness, you're declaring to your own heart, God was here, and God is still here, and God will be here, so I can trust him. But God's faithfulness is not just something to remember personally, it's something we should be declaring. Remembering God's faithfulness to us is an evidence for us to trust him in the present, but your life can also be an evidence for others to trust him. You can actually pass on the evidence of God's faithfulness when you share that story of faithfulness. Look at verse 27 and 28 with me. He says this, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then it tells us Queen Esther wrote some more letters confirming these days of Purim. And then it tells us this, the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. It was written in the book. This is something we're doing every single year so that not only we remember, but so that we pass on that remembrance of God's faithfulness to the next generation. God's faithfulness is something not only to remember, it is something to pass on. Over and over again in the scriptures, we're told to pass on God's faithfulness and works, to declare them and tell them to others. Psalm 105 says, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the people. Isaiah 63:7, I will mention the loving kindnesses of the Lord and of the praises of the Lord, according to all that the Lord has bestowed upon us. Psalm 96:3, declare his glory among the nations, his wonders among all peoples. 1 Corinthians 16:8, oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, and make known his deeds among all peoples. Psalm 71:15, my mouth shall tell of your righteousness and of your salvation all the day, for I do not know their limits. Mark chapter 5, when Jesus healed a demon-possessed man, he looked to him afterward and said, now go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. More verses that I have here, even all the way to the last book of the Bible in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 11, speaking of the accuser of the brethren, Satan, at first. Then it says this, but they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. That the testimony, the passing on from generation to generations, those testimonies is something that we see all throughout the scriptures. And even more specifically, the Bible tells us over and over, not only that we should just be declaring the goodness and the faithfulness and the works of God, but even more specifically, he says, you better do so to the next generation after you. In Deuteronomy 4:9, he says, only take heed to yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, but teach them to your children and your grandchildren. Psalm 78, we will not hide them from our children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord. and his strength and his wonder works that he has done. Deuteronomy 6:6-7. And these words shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. And Joel, the prophet, says, tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. Psalm 145, one generation shall praise your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts. And over, I've got 7 more right here that I could go over and over and over in Scripture that not only does it say we should declare it to all people, he says you need to be intentional about passing on the faithfulness of God, the goodness of God, the works of God. Pass those on to your children. Pass it on to your grandchildren. If you don't have any, pass them on to the children and grandchildren in your life, that the next generation would praise God for his wonderful acts to the children of men. Do it. Be intentional about that. Faith isn't just something that we hold, it's something that we hand off. We live it, we walk it, and then we pass it on. Every moment that we trust God, every prayer that we pray, and every truth that we live starts to become a legacy. And so we should endeavor to be a generation that shows the next generation how faithful our God really is. Now, how do we do this? Give us 2 ways that we can pass on the faithfulness of the word, or the faithfulness of the Lord. We pass it on through our testimony. Don't squander the testimony of God's working in your own life. Sharing the story of God, how God has brought you through, helps others to see the evidence of God's faithfulness. Why, when we meet for small groups or get together in smaller, more intimate settings, do we ask for praises along with prayer requests? Is it just something that we say? Like, anyone have any praises and prayer requests? No. We're a church body who's praying for each other and bearing one another's burdens and loving one another. And so occasionally we just want to hear, how is God working in your life? We've been praying for you. Has God been doing something? And when someone says, I just want to praise God, he's been doing this, all of us go, he's at work. We see him at work. It passes on the faithfulness of God to others when we do that. Share that testimony of praise. What if you shared your testimony of God's faithfulness on your social media? I think too often we use social media to put on a front, to make people think our lives are great and perfect and always full of love for our spouses and children and always beautifully put together and always fun and on and on. But what if social media was actually a tool that we use to declare the faithfulness of God? What if we actually used our social media to encourage other people in the faith rather than make our lives look all put together and perfect? What if instead of trying to make people think that our lives are perfect, we used our social media to make people realize that our God is perfect? Your testimony is evidence that God is at work and that God is faithful. So share that testimony. There's a song I've been listening to. It's kind of a hype song. So if you're not into just like a banger, then don't listen to this song. But it's called Sing of Your Love. And I love this section. It says this. It says, I've got a million reasons I shouldn't even be here, but I'm alive and breathing. It's all because of Jesus. So I just want to sing of your love. That's what the song says. He's saying, I shouldn't even be here by man's standards, but God has preserved me. God's faithfulness has been with me. And so I'm going to tell of that faithfulness. Even some of the things I mentioned a moment ago of ways that we can keep a remembrance for ourselves, those same things could be used to pass on the evidence of God's faithfulness to others. Journaling, writing a song, physical reminders, those remembrance can turn into a testimony to see that our God is faithful and can be trusted. This is why I journal, is because one day I want my kids to be able to, when I'm even gone, look at my words and say, God was faithful in my dad's life, and he'll still be faithful in my life. These can become things that not only remind us of God's goodness, but pass on God's faithfulness to the next generation. So we pass it on through our testimony, but we can also pass it on through our traditions. Now, often we hear that word tradition and we go, tradition is a bad thing. Meaningful tradition is not a bad thing. It's when tradition becomes traditionalism that it becomes a bad thing. But traditions in and of themselves are not a bad thing. Can't remember who said it, but a quote that I read even this week about tradition said, traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, but tradition is the living faith of the dead. So traditionalism is like a dead faith of the people who are currently here. They're just going through the motions. It's traditionalism. But tradition being passed down, meaningful tradition, is actually a living faith of those who have gone before, of those who are gone and dead. What are some traditions that we hold? Singing songs in church is a tradition that we hold to that passes on the faithfulness of God. Every single time we get together, I love just thinking about this. When you look through it, every time we come together, men, women, young, old, different generations, different families and backgrounds, and all of that come together and sing, "Great is thy faithfulness." What are we doing? The older generation is saying, "That's true in my life." And the middle generation is saying, "That's true in my life." And the younger generation, who maybe hasn't experienced yet, is hearing, "That's true in their lives. I bet it's true in my life." When we sing of how great our God is, how great is our God, what are we saying? It's like, He's been great in my life. He's been great in my life. And the next generation goes, "I bet He'll be great in my life." When we sing "Holy Forever," those first words say 1,000 generations falling down in worship, singing the Song of Ages to the Lamb. But when we sing that, we're not waiting for that day when there's 1,000 generations. We're going to do it now with maybe half a dozen or a dozen generations and sing it together. We're going to come together and remind ourselves of who God is and what He has done. That's a tradition that gets passed on and on and on. Some that are even given to us as ordinances of the church to establish as good tradition in the church. Baptism and the Lord's table, they're remembrances of who God is and in His gospel and the sacrifice that He made. And as we do it, as we administer baptism in the church, and as we observe the Lord's table, those who see it are reminded of God's faithfulness, of God's works, and they're seeing it being passed on to them. Days, even special days at church anniversary days. Next one's in October, our 5th year anniversary of the church. Why do we do that? It's just another day. Why do we set aside a day to say another year of the church, we were here? It's because it's a day where we set up as a tradition. This is a day we look back and we say, God has been at work in our church. Why do we want to do that? Because we know there's another year coming. And we say, we know God will still be at work in our church. So we remind ourselves of what He has done through these traditions. Even traditions in the home that we can establish with celebrations, birthdays, celebrate His faithfulness of another year. Anniversaries, celebrate the fact that all that the world and the flesh and the devil has thrown at you and your marriage, God's faithfulness is proved true because you are still here, and celebrate that. Family devotions or Bible talks can be a tradition that we're passing on our faith by teaching our families the faithfulness of God through the stories of the Bible and even through our own personal stories. And there are, again, so many other traditions we could start to remind ourselves of God's faithfulness and to pass it on to others. But your testimony and your traditions speak to those coming after you. God was here. Don't underestimate the impact of passing on to others that evidence of God's faithfulness. But notice as the book closes out that you can also display the evidence of God's faithfulness in your life, because you live out the evidence when you walk in faithfulness. Chapter 10 has 3 short verses that tell us of Mordecai and what he did in this new role as prime minister of Persia. It tells us this: "And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all of his countrymen." Now, I don't know if you've ever been like me and you've read through the book of Esther, and that just seemed random. Chapter 10, like just random 3 verses that are thrown in there. Like, didn't we already find out he got promoted? Didn't we already find out he was serving in this way? Why are we rehashing it? Well, I'm just going to take a quick moment, because I love doing this as we're teaching ourselves to study the Bible, that we're going to take a quick side road right here, okay? And do a Bible study talk just for a second, like a Bible study break. Okay, how many of you remember we've talked about things like structure of the scripture before? Yeah, you remember that? Structure of poems or structures of stories, things like that. A common one in the Hebrew scriptures is called a chiasm. It's a parallel that they start the story or the poem or something the same way as they end it, and then the next section is the same, and the next section is the same, and the next section is the same, so that the middle is really where you see the story or the poem get emphasized. Okay, now Esther, and you can find this if you can't see it all, is on thebibleproject.com. You can find the Bible Project. This is their graphic put together. But it's all put together in a specific way. Why did they talk about Mordecai's greatness at the end? Because the structure of Esther, what they were trying to do, was parallel everything. So Mordecai's greatness in the end parallels the king of Persia's greatness, Ahasuerus. You have Haman elevated on this side, Mordecai elevated on this side. You have Haman's decree to kill the Jews and Mordecai's decree to save the Jews. You have Esther and Mordecai planning to reverse the decree here. You have it again, how to reverse the decree over here. You have Esther's first banquet, and you have Esther's second banquet. And what happens right in the middle? That middle section of the story where everything starts to turn. You remember that section where Haman comes in thinking that the king is talking about himself, and he says, oh, I want to be elevated. Here's how I would elevate a man. And then he has to go and do it for Mordecai. That was where the story turns. And so the writer of the book of Esther, who I believe might have been Mordecai himself, as he's writing this, he's putting it in a structure to say, look at how this has taken place. Everything seemed to be going wrong, but then God did something in a moment, and everything completely reversed. Paralleled the opposite way. That's how God orchestrated this story. So that's how I'm going to orchestrate the story as I write it out. Okay, that's just a little Bible study break that we hit. That it's cool if you want to go do some further study on that and look at structures and other things we see. But what I want to focus in on this last section, okay, is that last line. I don't know if you noticed that last line that it tells us. It tells us that he sought the good of his people, and he spoke peace to all his countrymen. So the person we see Mordecai being throughout the whole story, someone who serves his country, serves his king well, and who looked out for the good of his people, he is still being that person even when he gets elevated to a high position. Earlier in the story, we saw he was true to his king. He heard of an assassination plot. He told of it. He was a true countryman, just as it tells us he is here. And he was looking out for the good of his people. He had sackcloth and ashes, and he wept for them. And he went to Esther and said, this is something that you should be doing. Maybe God put you in this place for such a time as this so that we might save his people. So the person that we see Mordecai being all throughout the story, even then when he becomes elevated, he doesn't become a new person. He's still faithful to seek the good of his people and to be seeking peace with all of his countrymen. So God's faithfulness isn't just something that we can remember, and it's not just something that we can pass on. God's faithfulness is actually something we can live out. We can live out faithfulness. Your faithfulness is a testament to God's faithfulness. It is an evidence of God's faithfulness in your life. When you are faithful, when you're faithful to God, to church, to ministry, to your marriage, to your children, to your friends, that is a testimony that God is at work in your life. It's a fruit of the Spirit, faithfulness is. And when that fruit is evident, it makes God's faithfulness evident as well. Your daily obedience is evidence that God's work wasn't just in one little moment. It's a continual movement in your life. And I can tell you from experience, it's attractive to those who see it. When they see your faithfulness, it draws them in. They want that kind of faithfulness. That kind of faithfulness is so rare in our world today. When they see that kind of faithfulness to something, it draws them in, and it can cause them, as they see God's faithfulness reflected in the way that you live your life, it can cause them to glorify your Father in heaven. To live out a faithful life so that you can see then, and others can see, the evidence of God's faithfulness in your life. So let me just close with a couple of questions as we've looked at this too, that would really just give us an actionable response to the word this morning. Okay, 10 questions. I'm just going to ask them, close with one thought, and then we're done. But think about these questions. Has God been faithful to you? I mean, if you really think about it, has God been faithful to you? I don't think any one of us would go, no. Not one of us would. But just sit with that for a moment. If he's been faithful to you, shouldn't that impact your life? Has he been faithful? How have you remembered or marked what God has done for you? Are you having a hard time in the moment to remember his faithfulness or see his faithfulness because you haven't been celebrating or remembering his faithfulness? Is there something you've forgotten or you've taken for granted? Are you actively sharing God's faithfulness with others? What stories in your life need to be told to your children? Need to be told to your friends or to your church? What physical reminders or rhythms could you build to remember God's goodness? Is there a new tradition that you need to start, or an altar you need to build, or a written testimony of some kind to remind you of God's goodness? What are you passing on to the next generation? Are they going to know God is faithful because of what they see in you? Are you living in a way that puts God's faithfulness on display right now? Are your choices reflecting trust in God even today? Is there a testimony that you've been keeping to yourself that needs to be shared? What hard thing in your life might become a story of God's redemption later? Maybe you're here and you're like, man, I love this thought, but like right now is tough. What is it that you can hold on to now? This seems to be not good. I love the statement that they say this: God is always working things out for good. So if it's not good, he's not done. So wait for the good. It might not be the good you're looking for, but it will be good because it's from him. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning, James tells us. So what is the thing now that you're like, this I believe will one day be a story of redemption that I can share? Look to it. What do you need to surrender or trust God with so that his faithfulness can be seen more clearly in your life? And then lastly, will your life leave behind a trail of evidence that points others to Jesus? If there's one thing we've learned from the book of Esther, it's that even when you can't see God, he's still there at work, accomplishing his good purposes in your life. You may not see it in the moment. You may not see it now. But when you're on the other side of it, you will see his hand all over the story. So remember and celebrate his faithfulness in your life. Pass it on to others and live it out because you are the evidence of God's faithfulness.